get started. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lori Jennings. I am the owner of Jennings ProSearch, which is an IT executive recruiting firm. And I am in the room, actually live, next to Scott Wayne, who is the owner of Envoy. Just want to give y'all a little bit of background on what we want to do today. So ask you to turn on your videos. We love to see your faces out there. Chat if you want to. You don't have to wait till the end. Put questions in there as you go. And love it if you just comment. We want to hear what you're doing, anything you think about what we're discussing. That makes it more fun. All right. So let me give you a little bit of background on Scott. He is the managing director of Envoy, and I'm at his Canvas Studios, one of his businesses. And this is so exciting for me because I haven't left my house to do a meeting since March 11th. So this is just great. And look at my background. It's very professional. Love it here. And I'm very fortunate to have him. So Scott, a little bit about him. He is a former British diplomat. He is a professional speaker, a negotiator, and a mediator. And again, he is the managing director of Envoy Portfolio of Studios. All right, Scott, welcome. Thank you so much for letting Nick twist your arm to be here today. And tell us how you're doing. And did you do anything fun over the weekend? Maybe something different as we started to open up our area?
I'm wet because I've been running back and forth from your building to my building and it's pouring with rain outside. So I'm slightly damp, but apart from that damp smell emitting from my shirt, I'm well. The weekend was interesting, wasn't it? City closed, counties open, though it felt like everything was open. I'm not sure there was a great deal closed this weekend. So I actually volunteered on Saturday afternoon delivering wood for Duron Chavez, who, if you don't know Duron, you should interview him actually, he's terrific. But Duron lost his job at Lewis Ginter Gardens during the cutbacks during the pandemic. And he started a nonprofit that is building raised garden beds for people who are experiencing food insecurity so they can learn to grow their own food, etc. So anyway, I was driving around on Saturday afternoon delivering piles of wood, which will then be turned into raised beds. And so I was driving around Chesterfield and down at Colonial Heights. And it was fascinating watching how different regions were showing different degrees of activity, which I think probably represents the United States right now, is people taking lots of different perspectives on this issue and how much of a threat it is or isn't, and mask wearing and distancing. And I'm not sure I came home on Saturday confident that we have a grip of this thing. Let's just say that.
Yeah. Did anybody else out there, if y'all have chatted, I'm curious to anybody who ventured out and tried a restaurant. I guess the counties, you were able to eat outside maybe? I haven't heard anything about that because I'm right there in the city area, but I'd love y'all if y'all want to chat and tell me what you're thinking. All right, why don't we start with you telling us a little bit about the Envoy, what you do and kind of how you've shifted strategies since March and how's it been going?
So maybe we talk about what we used to do and then what we have to do now, which are slightly different. So what we used to do, so the company's called the Envoy Portfolio, but there's three brands within that. Envoy is a consulting firm where we gather market intelligence and coach executives on how to influence how markets behave. So we're essentially a behavioral economics company. We study decision making and then build programs to shift those behaviors. So that can be anything from new consumer goods strategy to entering a new market, or it can be a leadership retreat where we have to get decision makers all aligned on the same side. So it's the combination of tradecraft, which you would learn in diplomacy school or in intelligence school, combined with stagecraft, which is settings and environments that get people to sort of point in different ways. So that was a consulting firm. And then we had a speaking agency called Evolve, where people from our disciplines spoke about how people make decisions and how you influence them. And then we had an event space, which is really a sort of leadership retreat center in Woodland Heights in Richmond, where we would bring people to talk through difficult issues. So two of those three businesses were all about in-person. And in fact, we were I realize I'm talking to the RVATECH community, we were very anti-digital. We would consistently make the case for being in room together, being able to interpret the five senses. And so I was one who would badmouth digital technology a great deal. Still will, actually, still will do it. But obviously 2 of those businesses died overnight. And so we had to think of something to do with those assets. And so while everybody was cutting back on investment, we were racing to buy. While the general population was buying bathroom tissue, we were buying camera equipment and cables and lighting before everybody sort of got into this, and evolved to be a digital production and content company, and Canvas to be a studio, which you can still rent for meetings once we get back to that stage. So we've been learning very quickly. It turns out it's not that complicated, but you have to be very disciplined. And that it's not TV. It's not the sort of thing that the Martin agency would do or a production company could do. It's still actually about the dynamics, about how people make decisions. In fact, we were on a call this morning with a global non-governmental organization, a humanitarian group, for which we're going to be running their annual general meeting. So the call participants this morning were from Kenya, the Gambia, and South Africa. And the meeting will be a kind of global meeting. And part of the discussion was actually how you don't use a lot of technology, how what's critical is the simplification of it. And particularly for a global meeting, it's not how terrific the production values are at the highest element of the bandwidth. It's actually the production values at the lowest element of the bandwidth. So we'll be producing a call where, you know, our team are in the United States running on what hopefully will be a fat pipe. But many of the participants and the presenters will be on very low bandwidth in Eastern or Central Africa. And so building the content for that. So we're finding that actually a lot of the things that we had to put into the in-person meeting actually are now going into the digital, and it's less about whether Teams will do this or Skype will do the other or Zoom will do that. More sort of how do you structure so that you're getting the right content down that pipe. It's kind of interesting. I never thought we'd be doing this though. It's very bizarre.
Yeah, I've seen you post pictures of yourself washing tables outside too, and seen all kinds of posts of maybe wedding site in your back here at Canvas, and all kinds of coffee. It's like looks fun.
No, it's desperate, isn't it? I mean, I do think that I do think this is funny. There seems to be 2 types of social media right now: those that are being honest and those that are in denial. I prefer the honest stuff, which is, God, this hurts. You know, we're scraping a living here, and we're clamoring for help. And then I think there's the BS version, which is everything is great. And it may be true. I struggle to believe that that's the case. I mean, the impact on this economy is not something, unless you're 95 years old, you've never lived through this before. And so the idea that everything's great, or I suspect some people are just sticking their head in the sand and waiting for normal to come back, which is also an interesting thought. But yeah, so we have been looking at what are our resources and where are their demands, and can we meet that demand with something that generates value? And oftentimes the answer is no.
All right, well, let's get into that, because a couple of weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago, when you and I first talked, we were prepping for this session, you made a comment that you were more pessimistic than the average American. Maybe it's because you're from England, you're a Brit. I'm not sure, but you said you saw people sitting around waiting for things to get back to normal. And you have a much more pessimistic view. You think that people need to scrap their pre-COVID 2020 strategy and start from scratch. So share a little more about what you mean about that, what you think people should be doing.
So pessimism is a rough word. I don't think I'm a pessimist, though I do think the Brits are given a gift, which I'll talk about in a moment, which are good for periods like this. So I like to think I'm a realist rather than a pessimist. But let's talk about the British gift. So the burden that you as Americans have is that your assumption is that things will be good and they will work. Therefore, you're set up for disappointment anytime it doesn't. Brits, on the other hand, we're set up for it will be a disaster and it won't work. So anytime it does work, it's a pleasant surprise. We've lowered the bar. So let me give you an example. When you board a flight in the United States, your expectation is that it will arrive in Atlanta on time. And if it doesn't, you're disappointed. When I board a flight at London Heathrow on British Airways to Paris, my assumption is it's going to be late. And so when it arrives on time, it's like, oh, that's great. It wasn't rubbish. And so we live a whole life of, if it isn't rubbish, that's kind of great. Where the US aspiration, its identity, its culture is all about winning and success and control. And I say that as a joke, but I do sort of mean this in a real sense, which is when we talk about going back to normal, what on earth was normal? I mean, this is what's so staggeringly fascinating to me. And I have a particular distaste for future forecasting companies, which I think are hilarious notions, where we talk about how interdependent the world is and how quickly things are moving, but this is what the future is going to be. And it's not just the pandemic. I mean, the pandemic is the largest of a series of outliers that we've experienced over the past, well, we always experience it, but let's just take the past 10 or 15 years. An outlier was 9/11. An outlier was the volcano going off in Iceland, which closed down all transatlantic traffic for, 6 to 8 weeks. An outlier was SARS. An outlier was and is Donald Trump. An outlier is Boris Johnson. An outlier is Emmanuel Macron in France. None of these entities were ever presumed to become realistic. They weren't in people's forecasts, yet have completely transformed the way in which we operate in the world. So when we talk about going back to normal, this is very confusing to me because all of our futures or all of our pasts have been defined by the prior outlier or series of outliers. So if we get more comfortable with there is going to be the next unexpected thing, then we're not surprised by it. We just respond to it. And so I do think that there's a lot of emotional and intellectual harm can be done by sort of craving to going back to something that we have no history of a significant change, and then it's just going back to whatever it was before. And that can be a good thing. We don't want that to happen with civil rights, for instance.
Great. Well, thank you.
Welcome to my soapbox. This is why it's miserable to work with me.
I think it's great, getting us to think. All right, so fast forward to today. This is maybe 3 weeks, since we've talked. States have started to open up at different paces. Different countries have started to open up. People have very strong opinions about what we should and shouldn't be doing, right? This is some important stuff. And it makes it difficult, just like politics. So this weekend, you had a post, which was titled, "I Was Wrong." And I guess the preface is everything you just shared, including, I don't know, what you just told me in this previous question, you're thinking that's no longer the priority for business owners. So what is the new priority that you think business owners should be focused on?
So first is a tip that if you want to get readership rates up on your email newsletter, then put a title like "I Am Wrong." And if you're also known to have a cocky and arrogant personality, then you're guaranteed a huge readership on that post. So my observation was of so much certainty about what we should do from some extremely smart individuals, while at the same time we're all acknowledging we haven't yet been able to measure the scope of the problem, which for me breaks the form. I can't write that down. I can't put that into a formula. That it seems to me that if you're smart and that you can do basic math, then you know the basic premises of research, that you know that we don't know right now because we can't measure it. We don't know what the thing is. And so everything we have beyond that point is a belief, not a statement of, it's not even a statement of thought. It's just a belief. It's an act, it's an expression of faith. So in my mind, the only intellectually valid argument to make is, I don't know, because we don't know the scale of the problem yet. What's been heartbreaking to me has been watching the public divide in very extreme ways between lock it down and open it up. I don't see a lot of nuanced discussion. And I think part of that is because we're suddenly into a belief statement. You might as well put Judaism and Islam on these scales because they're beliefs. They're not actually, and that's why you can sit and say you're wrong and I'm right, because it's essentially a zero-sum game of what God is. Well, we've replaced God with this virus and we haven't defined it yet. We don't know. We actually don't know how infectious it is. And we don't know its fatality rate yet because we're not counting. And our anger or our frustration, let's keep it polite, our frustration is being channeled at politicians who are making decisions, or government is often public health authorities, or in some cases, we've seen in Mexico attacks on physicians and nurses. rather than an anger that we're not counting the problem. So we're angry about the reaction to the problem, not angry that we didn't count it. And it blows my mind that, let's use my country. It blows my mind that the United Kingdom can maintain an independent nuclear deterrent at all times that can destroy the world, but we can't produce enough tests to measure how big this problem is in the first place. It's just staggering to me that we do that. But the frustration, let's keep it in the UK, the frustration of my people with their prime minister is about the government's response to this problem that we haven't defined. And so we just live in this constantly amorphous world, which I don't know how you measure this, but what is the stress rate of us having this threat that we can't define, that we don't know what it is? So I would love us to see us unified in our frustration that we can't measure this thing so that then we can have the fight, right? That should be the call to unity for me. If you're flying a, let's use stereotypes, if you're flying a "Don't Tread on Me" flag and you're flying a rainbow flag, we should all be allied right now and outraged that the greatest powers in this world can't solve for this, when two have proven they can, Germany and South Korea. I'm going to exclude Australia and New Zealand because they're islands thousands of miles from anywhere else. It's a much easier problem to solve. But in South Korea and Germany is almost literally landlocked. It's almost landlocked, but has managed to measure the problem, therefore come up with reasonable solutions to it. And yet it seems that Anglo-Saxon countries can't. So we're arguing over something we can't define over what's right. So what I was making the case for is, I think strategy reinventions are really important, but maybe the biggest priority right now is conflict resolution protocols, because we have given license to everybody to just fight, just to argue and debate, and nobody can be proven right or wrong. So in the absence of that, we have to have protocols to allow people to, frankly, yell at each other. There you go. We should do this on video call. Kim, you can yell at Jay, and Mary, you can yell at Christine, and Tara, you can yell at Andrea.
I don't yell.
Do we have to? That's what I do on every other frickin' Zoom I'm on.
So yeah, I'm worried. I'm actually, I'm pessimistic, aren't I? I lied. I'm really pessimistic.
Yeah, but can I ask a question on that though, Scott? So like getting at the nuance. So if you go to your wheelhouse in negotiations, could you talk a little bit or add to the problem with shutting down conversation in a negotiation setting? So like you don't want to close the door. You've got to keep it open. And it feels to me that right now, like we can't collectively have a conversation anymore. And are there any tips from a negotiation table that we could use in day-to-day conversations with friends or neighbors or whatever to try to be less threatening and try to get at some of the nuance discussion, like instead of everybody at or, get us to and?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yes, there are, and it's also not comfortable, and it almost runs in contradiction to some of our values. So it's a little bit in this realm of free speech and hate speech, and different countries' take on it. Because what I'm seeing is that in this debate, if we say everybody has an equal voice, at what point do you factor out the ludicrous? So, and there is a technique which you're seeing some of the political groups, not the political parties, but the political groups use, which is, if we're going to say we're going to take a moderate angle on something, let's throw this out to the most extreme so that the middle skews one side or the other. And I think in a negotiation, the role of the moderator or the mediator is to disallow the out of frame. So you're defining the frame of what's reasonable. In society, you've got to depend upon civic leadership to do that. And in some levels, in some places in governments across the world, we've got people who are willing to play that extreme game to nudge it into a particular direction. And so some things I'd encourage is sort of you set your own boundaries, just like knowing you, Kim, I assume you wouldn't, you would preclude free speech within your organization to include blatant racism or sexism, for instance. I think there are places for organizations. I do actually have a lot of faith in business to help with this challenge, which is we are going to quote sources of our arguments, if these are real arguments. We are going to state whether we believe in science or not. And if we believe in science, we're going to reference science in our arguments. And there's plenty of data sets that can make different cases for things, but at least let's ground them in that as we go through. And so, yeah, it's like, it's not so much that we're saying what the approach should be, but how we expect our people to debate and argue. And I think that's why I'm focused on a protocol rather than an outcome. It's the how we talk about this, not the what we talk about it. And what is, do we treat all statements equally? We can treat all belief statements equally. So if I say, I believe we should do this, sure, go at it. Everybody can. And actually, once we're in the realm of belief, you're in the realm of spirituality and religion. And actually, sexism does play a role in that. And racism does play a role in that. In the realm of intellectual thought, if I think we should do this, I think we can set parameters around sort of the basis from which we draw those opinions. No different from if somebody was presenting a business case for investment. Okay, what's your, you know, what are the parameters of how you made this decision? So yeah, now I've been looking for a protocol that would work for it. I haven't found one. We might have to draft something from stuff that's out there.
Yeah, so talk a little bit more about the ways we can reduce conflict in our businesses. You had some great strategies in that post this weekend.
So the first one is language. And, you know, it's remarkable. When I say we should, then, so let's try it. We should open up everything tomorrow because the economy is more important than saving all people's lives. All of you have had an emotional reaction to that. You just have, you can't control it. And whether I believe it or not is irrelevant, you still had an emotional reaction to it, either in favor or against or any of those things goes. When I say my personal perspective is I believe the economy is more important than adding an extra couple of lives to the elderly population, and I believe X, you don't have the same emotional response to it because I've contextualized where I'm coming from it. I haven't made my argument mean that your argument is wrong. I've actually opened you to reflect your opinion as well. And so, especially in the English language, at least, the way we use words, and particularly over a digital channel, become absolutely critical because I can't soften the blow of my aggressive statement through my body language. You can see me even on camera now trying. I'm using my hands to try to placate. But body language is also quite a tell. So one of my most disliked phrases is, the reality is. It's actually used very widely. People say the reality is, and it often goes with a hand gesture like this. The reality is this. The reality is this. What I'm doing is I am imposing my reality on your world. This is the reality. It's one of the most lethal business phrases, I think, that's out there. Now, of course, what we're actually talking about is this is my perspective and this is my feelings on the issue and this is how I view this information set. Well, if we say those things instead, we get less of an aggressive response. And so there's a really telling gift of that. The other is changing our mindsets to when we see something that we find abhorrent or offensive. And look, I've lost friends and colleagues to COVID-19. This is becoming a personal issue for many of us now. Then it's very natural for us to either switch off or for us to go on the attack. And if we can get ourselves to be interested in people's opinions rather than judging people's opinions, and the test for this is that our head tilts to the side instead of leans back. So when we're offended, then we tend to lean back in shock. So Laura, if you were to say something, for instance, if you were to say, Great Britain is not the greatest country in the world, then I would lean back in shock and awe and be deeply offended by everything you said. If I can change my mindset on that and say that instead of having that reaction, I'm going to practice having an interested reaction. When we're interested in something, our head tends to tilt to the side. So Laurie says, actually, Great Britain isn't the greatest country ever known to mankind, humankind. Instead I go, oh, it's interesting that you feel that way. Well, that head movement is also associated with sympathy, right? Is that we go, oh, you feel that way? And there's this fantastic mechanism in the human body is that our bodies react to our feelings, but also our feelings react to our body movement. So one thing we can practice is when we hear something that is morally offensive to us or intellectually offensive to us, we force our head into this movement. right? It's like physical exercise because our mind associates this body movement with interest. And so now I'm sort of, oh, I'm interested. And in your head, you can still say, I'm interested in why you have that stupid opinion. But now I'm intrigued as to why you have that stupid opinion. I'm not busy judging you as a human and who you are. Once you start getting into this rhythm, it gives you a power to then say, I wonder why they feel like this. And even if you do it selfishly, I wonder what in their life caused them to be so wrong, right? And so you're like diving into this from their perspective. And over time, you actually get to a place of like, oh, they're feeling threatened, they're feeling bullied, they're feeling insecure. And you can sort of portray this. I wish the liberal community could look at those largely young men who are marching into state capitals with semi-automatic weapons and tilt their heads and go, I wonder what they're missing. Like, what is it in their life that they're missing right now? And it's really hard to do because whatever persuasion you're from, or if you're in the open it up, economy is more important side of things, and you're listening to somebody say that everybody should stay home and not go anywhere. It's like, I wonder what's behind that. Is then just in your posture, everything just calms down. It doesn't mean that you're wrong. It actually means you're more arrogant in a way, because instead of just being offended, like, oh, let's investigate how broken your brain is. So it allows you to play to that sense of rightness, but just practicing that, trying to get to the bottom of it. I will say it's almost impossible to do this within a domestic setting. So this is the professional stuff of people that you have a professional relationship and not a personal relationship with. It's extraordinarily difficult to have that conversation with people that you love, right? Because your relationship is love. We do have those reactions. So just good luck with that. Make sure you have a garden shed you can go hide in.
Yeah, that's why I'm not going out too much, because I'm not sure what I can, I'm not sure my opinions always match my family members. Talk about counter argument. I love this. Like for people in business, how can people use the counter argument?
Oh,
Their employees, people that work for them.
This is one of my favorite exercises. Once you can all get together again and you do like your leadership team retreat, run this exercise and try to run it over drinks if you can. So counter argument comes from the format of the Oxford Union debates, or it's being put on broadcast by a group called Intelligence Squared. If you look up Intelligence Squared on YouTube, you'll find these debate formats. But the Oxford Union format is essentially that there's a proposition to the House. Okay, the House believes X, Y, and Z. And then you have somebody argue in favor and somebody argue against, and then you can take rebuttals and then questions, and the audience votes for who made the better argument. Okay, so that's the Oxford Union debate style that you see and is fairly common. Counter argument is a twist on that, which is, so let's say, Laurie, you and I were debating. The motion might be that RVATECH should merge with its equivalent in DC. And you may believe it should, and I believe it shouldn't. And so you would argue in favor of the motion, I would argue against the motion. You'd get to rebut my argument, I get to rebut yours, vice versa. Okay, easy. In this setup, we have to argue the opposite of what we believe. Excuse me. So if you're in favor of the merger with the DC group, you have to argue against it. And if you get the idea. Mm-hmm. And the audience rate you on how well you argue against what you believe. And this is fantastic for leadership groups ahead of an acquisition or a merger or entering a new market. You as the CEO get to see your team arguing against their own intellectual arguments, because it proves that they've thought through what they're doing. I love it because lots of people get partway through this exercise and say, actually, I've changed my mind. I was wrong. Like now I've looked at the other side. It's something else. One of the reasons I like it is because it's fun, and you're rating people on their probity of arguments, and watching people, especially in organizations where somebody's had a view for a long time and they're famous of having that view, and now the way they win is destroying their own argument, makes for a fantastic sort of cocktail hour leadership development session as you go through. So that's the exercise. But I think doing that individually with employees right now, which is when they come to you with a proposal, that they also have to have the counter argument to their own proposal. And you rate them on that. So it might be, here's the case why we need to invest in this technology. And then here's the case why we shouldn't. Here's the case why we should hire these people in the case we shouldn't. Here's the case we should lay off these people in the case that we shouldn't. Because we're going to have some really, really tough decisions ahead of us. You know, the Federal Reserve and the federal government have essentially punted the economic impacts of this. So everybody's riding along right now on government checks and incredible liquidity in the markets. And you can only postpone that so long. And so when those hard decisions come to rest, then what matters is not probably the issues that you're deciding on, but the process for you making decisions and how close to optimal they can be. And that's my obsession at the moment. It's the nerd that I am, is that we're doing a really lousy job of distinguishing between sunk costs and opportunity costs. So sunk costs are the things we've invested in, all those passion projects, the equipment, the stuff, the people we invested in. And then the opportunity cost is the cost of doing something, the cost of not doing something by choosing the path that you're on. And so let's just take meetings, right? Or travel, which is like on the headline of everybody right now. So everybody wants to do digital everything, and nobody has invested in digital. Nobody's invested in digital. No large company, by a margin. But we haven't seen mass layoffs of everybody in the event planning industry. But we're all saying we don't think events are going to come back in a huge thing. We're not even seeing massive investment in getting those events people to a digital platform. We're just in denial over that. We're seeing it in like public transportation decisions. Cities still going forward with public transportation investments at a time when nobody can work out how we're going to get people to ride the subway. So I think we've got a lot of sort of deferred decision-making coming that is going to be really hard, and the protocols for doing that are going to be critical. And those poor souls that are at the sort of top of those pyramids, the amount of micro choices they're going to be presented with is where you need the protocol to allow those decisions to go lower down the chain. And that's going to be, I'm not an organizational development person, but I think from a protocol standpoint, that's going to be the challenge, is how do we push decision-making down around these things? The work from home thing, the press today about Silicon Valley embracing work from home. I'm sorry, Silicon Valley was the place of more brains than anywhere else, and we need a pandemic to work out that people can work from home, and now it's the greatest, coolest thing. I don't think so. There was a reason that that they built those workspaces, was all about collaboration and everything. And now it's suddenly we don't need any of that. And so I think what that's showing is sort of an absence of framework around decision making, not so much an absence of strategy, but how do we make choices as things change? Right. This is why my team drink, because I talk about these subjects and it's so boring, and then they hit the grog at the end of the evening. I think it's great. So for say somebody like myself, or some of the businesses out there, and we know we need to make some changes, but we're just kind of stuck. You know, how do you get going? What are a couple of pieces of advice to get us started down the right path? So can I be an optimist now? Yes. Right, well, which is how you deliver a speech. You depress the crap out of everybody and then bring them to the light. Okay, so if things get really desperate, we'll start a church. So I think this is really exciting, because there have been a raft of things that we always knew we should do, and now we have the excuse to do it. We have that push that makes it happen. It reminds me of entrepreneurship a little bit, when people say, you know, so what led you to go start your company? And there's all this guff out there about, like, you write the business plan and you go raise money. And 90% of cases, that's not true. 90% of cases, you lost your job and you were desperate, and your risk profile was so low that you could just start the company. That's most entrepreneurship stories. And so just like business change, I think, you know, we have on paper all of these things that it could be and it should be, but we need that extra nudge. And COVID-19 has come along that gives us that extra nudge. Nick and Lindsay and Mary and I've had this conversation around Tech RVA, which is, okay, we've got this series of events. What was the purpose of those events? Let's strip that down and see the best way to get there. And by the way, let's do that anyway. Even if we find a vaccine for COVID-19 tomorrow, let's look at the core of what we're doing. And I think everybody has the chance to do that. So let's take aviation. Wow, it turns out that we're all going to have a little bit more space on planes right now, and the planes are going to finally be cleaned. and that face masks for international travel probably isn't a bad idea anyway, given how circulatory systems work and translation. And we're going to have fewer planes in the air. It's going to be a little bit more expensive to fly. Well, that's probably not a bad thing either. So what all of the airlines have done is they've retired all of their inefficient jets. So all of those gas guzzlers are now gone, and they've been replaced by the latest state-of-the-art stuff. And we're going to have a smaller airline footprint. Well, that's probably not such a terrible thing. Meeting structures are probably going to change so that we do the things that aren't required to be in person digitally, plenary sessions, education sessions. And then instead of a 4-day conference, you got a really intense 1.5 days of peer review, and density is going to be really important. I don't think that's a terrible thing either. Hotel rooms might finally be clean. Who knows? There's hopes to be out there. I also think there's a chance for meritocracy if we do this right. So there are massive health implications for the underserved, particularly in this country, based upon how the health system operates. But there's going to be this emergence of desire for skill sets versus academic credentials that I think becomes really interesting. So if you're, I'm looking at people who are on this call who have hiring things. So Amy's doing digital over at Swedish Match. Jimmy's running a technology company. Kim's running a tech company. Do we really care whether you went to UVA or not and read humanities? Like, I don't give a shit. And I went to those fancy, well, not that fancy school, but I went to fancy schools, and I banked on that resume, and I banked on all that type of stuff. I care now whether you can code, whether you can show up on time, whether you can deal with ambiguity, I'm much more interested now in whether you delivered pizza while you're at college than whether you went, like which college you went to. And so I think that generates an opportunity for that. My one worry around that is how do we meritocratize networks? Because if you physically can't meet somebody anymore to pitch for that opportunity, to pitch for that job, do we become more dependent upon exclusive circles of LinkedIn connections and digital connections where just penetrating in there is really hard? So Laurie, in your world, I think on the recruitment side becomes even more important that we're opening up these digital networks to people who may not have inbound connections into these worlds where university and college sometimes would. So this isn't my world, but I think there's an interesting challenge and opportunity around hiring. And then the next is globalization. So, while there are all these tariffs on goods and products, now we're in this digital planet, and we realize actually you don't need to be in San Francisco to do this work for this tech company, or you don't need to be in Richmond to do this work for the tech company. Why aren't we hiring graphic designers in Kenya? Why aren't we hiring individual coders in Vietnam? You lift the barrier beyond the language, and in most of, there are no shortage of countries where English is the first language, and no shortage of countries where English is a very well-spoken second language. I think there's a window for equity around the world. It's very hard for me to import goods and services from Nairobi, Kenya. It's very easy for me to hire a brilliant graphic designer there. And so we might see some global redistribution of hiring and talent. Not just from sort of the Silicon Valleys and the New Yorks down to places like the Richmonds and the Portland, Maines, but also globally. So I think everything's up for grabs. This isn't what's the phrase? It's not an interruption. It's a deep, deep disruption.
Great, thank you. All right, so it's about 12:39. I want to hear some questions from you in the audience. What questions do y'all have? You can ask it you can unmute yourself and ask the question directly, or you can stick it in the chat box. I see some comments in the chat box.
Casey, improv comedy. Yes. Yeah. I mean, embracing, leaning into it. It's hard though.
Comes in handy, but sometimes it does get me punched in the face, or at least I have to dodge a punch, but makes life entertaining. But not so much lately, because no people can reach me.
That's why I have a face that looks like this.
So mine's more of a comment, and I had actually sent this privately over to Casey. One of the things that was like a real aha moment for me recently is that I personally had gone through like the 5 or 7, however many stages there are of grief. In the very beginning, I definitely went through this period where I just felt helpless. I felt paralyzed. I felt like you know, what are we all going to do? Is everyone going to be okay? And I couldn't get out of like my own head. And, you know, of course, then I got, you know, angry, and then, you know, I'm in denial that, you know, everything's going to go back to normal. Right. I, and when I went back and I analyzed like what I went through, which I could have only done once I hit acceptance, I was able to go, wow, like I was grieving. I was really grieving. I was grieving the loss of the life that I had before, and, you know, grieving loss of people that I knew. And that was a big aha moment for me. And I feel like a lot of people, if they take a step back, maybe have gone through the same thing. I don't know. But
Yes.
it was cathartic for me to understand that about myself.
Yeah, I think that's a great observation, and it's a very real thing, and we'll understand the costs of it better later as we're able to study it. I think a couple of things are worth saying in that, in terms of when you're communicating with employees or customers, is keeping the backdrop that you're dealing with people going through grief, and most of them won't even realize they're going through grief, and so that exacerbates those emotions as they're dealing with it. I think there is some upside in that, is that much of what we're grieving for is personal connection. And so while everybody's excited about, you know, how great this is for tech in the short term, and I agree, of course it is. Actually, the greatest upside is there's an equipment manufacturer that's called Zoom. It makes a lot of sound equipment, and its stock price has rocketed because people have got the wrong Zoom that they've been investing in. So you just need to start a company called Zoom on the public markets right now. It'll do great. But there is this, I think in the longer term, what we've realized is how much we don't like technology, and how as humans, we actually crave that connection. And I don't think people are, this anger about restaurants, I don't think people are craving the restaurant food, clearly, because you can get takeout in most cases. We're missing the Cheers effect. We're missing, God, I'm Laurel's is down the street from here. God, I miss walking into that bar and Michael Smith hurling some abuse at me as I walk through, and Kendra serving me a drink and then bantering with some neighbor that's there. And I think that's a good thing that we miss. I really hope that Richmond maintains its love of bikes and public parks and all of those things that are there. But I do think we start getting into the realm of habits. One of the reasons I was in favor of, there are a couple of reasons I'm in favor of Richmond keeping the stay at home for an extra couple of weeks. But one of them is that it is indoctrinating those habits a little more. And, you know, if you were to ride by Forest Hill Park yesterday, everybody was spaced, they're all in families, but it was packed. You never see it like that. And personally, if that comes at the cost of Short Pump Mall, I'm willing to live with that. I think that's not a bad societal outcome. But on the grieving, I think when we look back at this, and we will do some research around this, we've partnered with a professor at VCU Health who covers public health, and we're interested in the intersection between sort of how the physicians view the world and how behavioral economists like us view the world. Is that I suspect when we look at some of the gaps, yes, there'll be the testing thing that I talked about earlier, but we fail to have a call to action, especially for Americans. The call to action was essentially, don't do anything. Which, if you want to torture the average American, it's to say, hey, we've got this huge threat. Your job is don't do anything. Don't spend money. Don't even raise money. Don't rally. Don't do anything. Just stay home. Which is ironic because most Americans love to sit on the couch and watch Netflix, right? And so we were actually asking people to do things that they would choose to do in their leisure time, but we told them in a crisis that what they need to do in a crisis is do, for most of us, to do what we do in our leisure time. And the irony, of course, is that Americans are now outraged that they can't exercise. Oh my God, the most overweight nation on earth is pissed off. You want to see what the foreign press are writing about this, right? It's like, it's insane. It's like, I don't have the right to go run. When was the last time you ran? Oh, 7 years ago. And so, but I do think what's underlying this is we needed something to rally around. Like, we needed something to do. And I do think in retrospect, the place that the public health authorities might have missed is not having somebody like a Dan Ariely on staff or a Daniel Kahneman on staff that said, this is the psychological damage we're going to do if we say, here's this threat, we can't define it, and you just need to sit tight and let the professionals deal with this. And if you look at all prior analogs of a crisis, this wasn't what happened. Even after 9/11, which we were really dependent upon the National Guard and the military and the intelligence services, President Bush was saying, go donate blood. And it was clever because we actually didn't need blood, but he told us to go donate blood anyway. Hug your neighbors, you know, go, you know, talk to me, whatever it happens to be. But there was nothing to protest. There was nothing to, there's just nothing. And I think that has had its own toll in a way. And we just have to wait and watch the economic cloud come towards us. So thanks for your comment about grieving. I think we start to work out the cost. And I do think that becomes the formula as we make this choice going forward. We like to say that we don't put a price on lives. We put a price, we've always put a price on lives. We've always done it. We do it around road safety. Actually, we're probably like to find in 2002, more people died than in the 9/11 attacks as a result of choosing to drive instead of to fly, because they perceived flying as more dangerous, even though it's significantly safer than driving a car. Okay, so we know from those behaviors that more people died as a result of their narrative fears. And I think we may well see something similar, which is when we start to measure the lives that were lost by people who didn't go to hospital because they were having heart problems because of these narrative fears. So as we map this out, so whatever the baseline is, once we get the infection rate and the fatality rate for this thing, is then starting to trade off, what are we willing to do in terms of domestic abuse, in terms of mental health, and you start to build a holistic picture of what those trade-offs are. And as a democratic society, you make those choices. We do it over road safety, we do it over flying. If we want to save 100,000 lives a year, we reduce the speed limit to 20 miles an hour everywhere we go and put rubber buffers on the side of the roads. Like, we can choose to. So we price life already, but there are some good measures for it. So there's this thing called quality life years. And what that references is economists put a price on what a fully lived year of life is. And so they factor in health conditions and they factor in mobility and age and all of these different things. And the number that you're going to like to do. And so there are models where you weight the value of younger people, for instance, more heavily than those that are older. There are lots of models for us to make this decision, but we've got to stop yelling at each other and start arguing about the nuance of that instead of, you know, who's right and who's wrong.
Right now, we do need to give blood. They do need it right now. I'm just saying. That was the last thing that I did before lockdown, and I just hit 8 weeks again. So please give everybody go give blood.
I know Jim did, because last time we were talking, he said he had just given blood.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, I do think there's a role for. I think there's a role for organizations like RVATECH to play in all of this. So the most worrying thing to me is that people don't understand what exponential is. Because regardless of your view of the virus itself, once you understand that the infection rate can be controlled in the short term, but the absence of people understanding how that R number works, to me, is kind of terrifying. And there was there's a great editorial several years ago from the former Surgeon General. So it was once they were out of the position, and he wrote this piece that we don't have a smoking problem in the United States. We have an education problem in the United States, is that educated people don't smoke, or they smoke and they give it up, right? Then one could argue that we didn't have a public health crisis here, or in the UK, we had a math crisis. Is that once you understand that enormous power of the triad of separation, washing hands, and if you can't separate, wear a mask, then we can nail this. But there are so many narratives out there of like, this is dumb because I'm only meeting Jimmy or Cindy or Cynthia or whatever it happens to be, is that it became a problem. So you could argue that teaching science technology might be the thing that helps us avoid these things in the future. It's also staggering to me that we think this is terrible, but actually this could be so much worse. I mean, we have to prepare for a pandemic whose infection behavior is like the flu, like this one seems to be, but fatality rate is like Ebola. Then we're in sort of real territory. This seems more like a practice run for me, for us to get this right and have people understand what the ramifications are. I went pessimistic again. See, I was going upbeat. Now I made us all sad. I'll tell a joke.
Do you have that joke? You said you get.
All right, I'm going to finish on this. You want to do this? Okay. So here's your thought for the day. And it comes from an old guy from the British Embassy who's probably dead now. He's probably not still alive. When you're posted to America as a diplomat, you go to Washington, D.C. or New York for a briefing before you head out. And my briefing was when I was posted to California. And my briefing was given to this old guy actually it was at the consulate in New York. So I flew to New York for my briefing. And the first thing he said was, ignore everything you've ever thought you knew about America as you arrive here. And don't listen to Americans when they describe what America is. So it's not like Hollywood. And also most Americans don't know what America is. And he said, so the reason for that is that if you ask Americans their values, they will all describe the same values, and they are Midwestern values. So you ask an American in Miami, an American in Texas, American in California, what their values are, they will describe Midwestern values. If you observe their behaviors, Midwesterners live up to those values and nobody else does. And so you'll be confused for at least the first 2 years you live here, because Americans will describe that they believe this, but then do almost the opposite of it. So the reason for that is that there isn't one nation and there isn't 50 nations, there are 7 nations. If you study them anthropologically, you'd find there's the nation of the Northeast, the nation of the South, the nation of the Midwest, the nation of Texas, the nation of the Southwest, Pacific Northwest, and then California maybe, but Southern California might be its own thing. So it's 7 or 8. And his point was that a Texan has as much in common with a Vermonter as a Scotsman has with a Russian. And actually the geography is exactly the same. But we tell ourselves in the US that we are the same. And so we're shocked when it's different. And when you think about it, the United States is the only country in the Western world that does the Pledge of Allegiance every day. It's the only country that gets obsessed with standing and how you manage the flag and all that. I could run around wearing a Union Jack as a kilt and nobody would care. It's the only country that plays the national anthem at all sports games. The only time you'll hear us sing God Save the Queen is when England plays New Zealand in the rugby or there's some national competition. That's why none of us know the words to it. Why do you do that? Because it's this magical experiment of whether you can take a continent and turn it into a country. And it's brilliant. That's what makes the place special. It's what makes it amazing. But when we deny the regional cultures, then that's what leads to our shock when we don't agree. So when we look at that map of who's opening and who's closing, it fits those nations almost entirely. And we just go, oh, this is it. This is how these nations work. In this one country of 7 nations, this is how we work. So Texas is going to open. California is going to stay closed. The Northeast is going to be slower to open. The South's going to go at it and make sure it can do brunch on a Sunday. And the Midwest is going to probably be pretty sensible about this because that's what their values are. And the Pacific Northwest is probably going to find a technology solution for it while it hikes. And that's what it's going to do. And so look at it. It's really interesting. It's a fascinating way to look at America. And it gives texture for some of these things that are going on. But sometimes it might also give us some insights into what's going on, which is why Richmond's fascinating, because it sits on the border between 2 nations. It's between the Northeast and the South. And so we get both, which is why we're so schizophrenic and beautiful.
Thanks for explaining that. Because I do feel schizophrenic sometimes, yeah.
That's why we can have tattoo parlors and breweries, and then everybody dresses to go to church on Saturday morning and then goes to the tattoo brewery. We're living on the border country.
Yeah, so we've got a couple more comments in here. Does anybody else want to, ask a question or speak out loud about anything? Casey's in there. Thank you, Casey, for all your comments. They're great.
No, I never shut up, I mean, that's why self-branded is the mighty mouth, but at least mostly I use a keyboard.
I know this is the first one of these I've seen you in. This is great.
I want to ask Roman, when are you doing one of these so we can get the Frenchman's perspective on all this?
Yes.
Or that was it. That was.
On a spot, Roman, do you have any comments on that?
No comment.
Said like a true Frenchman. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, I'll tell you what is interesting though. I mean, if we can all take a step back, is Europe is offering some interesting parallels. you know, how each of the countries are doing it. Scandinavia in particular is really fascinating, where they're taking different approaches. So very similar sized countries, apart from Sweden. Sweden's sort of double the size of Finland and Denmark, but they're all 5 to 10 million people, and their numbers are very different. Everybody's obsessed with Sweden right now because they've taken a more laissez-faire approach. But I actually think Denmark is fascinating, where they've really gone to like the technicality of it rather than the sort of moral argument, and said, well, how do we be as effective as possible? So they've gone pretty much halfway between the UK, which has terrible numbers, and between Spain, that had terrible numbers and went into complete lockdown, and Sweden, which has really opened up. But in the Danish example, they're just being stupendously nuanced about what they're doing, how they design restaurants, how they design schools. Everything is up for redesign, and are going at it, and they seem to have found an interesting balance. And I'm really hopeful that the US will do something along those lines. Of course we can reinvent education. Of course we can reinvent transportation. It's America. It's what we do here.
Yeah. I was only kind of, because that was very interesting. I hadn't heard the 7 nations approach before, but I think I am interested in kind of Roman's perspective and just Europe in general. For me, one of the biggest flaws in how information is being presented is comparing the US to like Italy, because for me it would be more appropriate to compare New Jersey to Italy, or Texas to like, why aren't we looking at the EU versus the US? And I'm just curious just how other people think about that, because when I'm looking at the data and the numbers, I'm like, well, that's not apples and oranges that we're talking. If you ask me should we have universal health care, of course. Do I think we can solve that problem and get 300 million people to agree on what that looks like? No, never. And so I don't know. I'm just, it's kind of like finding that place in the middle. Do we end up breaking up into these 7 nations, or it's just interesting?
Stacey?
I would posit that this particular situation, all that's going on where we find ourselves, shows the need to move beyond the idea of borders at all. I mean, that's not going to happen in our lifetimes. But in a couple hundred years, it might be interesting to see what the human race has done in the time since. But stay tuned for updates.
So let's bring this back to Joral's world, because I think there is a parallel in the language to computer viruses and cyber. It's been interesting to me that people haven't been making more of a connection to that. But obviously all of the dynamics that we've seen in terms of crippling infrastructure that the health pandemic has done, then cyber can do the equivalent for. And I do think it's going to, just like it leads questions around isolations of humans, which may not be international borders, Casey, to your point, but borders around schools, size of schools, how much you integrate, how much you separate, all of those questions have direct parallels to the technology world, whether that's do we have nanogrids for energy? Do we close circuit some things? Like that interdependency that has been this healthcare virus, where now it's pretty clear that while we thought the COVID-19 was only arriving in arriving in Europe later. Actually, the first cases were really early on in the crisis. The French have confirmed that they had a case in December in France. That there's a parallel with networks, and what do we take from this health crisis to learn about networks and how we manage those? I wrote this post several weeks ago, but thank God those people that are doing cyber patrol are still doing cyber patrol. Can you imagine what a penetration would look like today in this environment with this? Whether it was even on basic communications platforms. I mean, we're worried about, idiots writing racist stuff on Zoom calls, but take away some of that critical infrastructure and we live in a very different place. So I think some scenario planning does ask some questions, and our dependency upon 3 or 4 companies to exist. I'm not sure this has been the technology companies' friends from an antitrust perspective once people start to put a lens on the dependency that we have right now.
All right. Well, we're right at 1. I don't know if there's any other questions. You can jump off if so. If anybody else has any comments or wants to stay on, please feel free to do that. Is there anything else? I don't see any questions in here. Great discussion, everyone. I really appreciate you turning on your videos. It makes it so much more fun. And then just speaking up and putting in the chat box. I want to thank Nick for giving me this opportunity as they pivot at RVATECH. And there's something coming up on Thursday that he and Scott and his team have put together. So I'm looking forward to seeing that from the studio right here. I've walked around. This is amazing. Anybody who hasn't been down here, come check it out. See if, you know, I think you're giving away, was it coffee? Is that what you're doing, Scott, on the week?
So we're using our parking lot for different things. So there was a cookie stand yesterday for a nonprofit that's creating cookies and selling those. And then occasionally we've got a stand outside. We open up the coffee stand and just let people walk by and pick up a free cup of coffee. So keep an eye on social media. We post it as we're just trying to safely and smartly get some community running.
Awesome. Well, thank you for your time. Again, thank y'all, and we'll see you next week.